In this lesson, you're going to learn about a process called factoring trinomials using what we call the double bubble method, which is just a shortcut name we use for this method. Let's take a look at some examples that better explain this concept. Let's look back at some concepts that you should already be familiar with. That way, this will help make this concept a little easier to understand. Let's take a look at this first box, where it says 4 times 3, and the answer down here is 12. 4 and 3 are called factors of 12 because they both divide into 12. If you look at the middle box, we have two binomials, and you should have learned before how to FOIL these, which means to multiply them. To do that, we take x times x and add the exponents, giving us x squared. Then we take that same x and multiply it by the 2, which would be 2x. We then take the 3 and multiply it by the x, giving us 3x, and then 3 times 2 is 6. From there, we look for like terms, which would be the middle terms because they both have the same variable with the same exponent. We add their coefficients, 2 and 3. We'll drop down the x squared, add those, which is 5x, and then drop down our constant. And we have no more like terms, so this would be our answer. And notice it matches what I have typed in red. Going back up to the original two binomials, those as well are called factors of the trinomial. So down here below is the trinomial, and if you break it down into its factors are x plus 3 times x plus 2. The same way that for 12, the factors are 4 and 3. Now what you're going to be doing in this lesson is you're going to be working backwards. You're going to start with the trinomial, and you're going to do what we call factor it because you're finding its factors. And its factors should end up being the x plus 3 times x plus 2. The question is, how do we get to that? In this process, we call double bubble simply because we think of these parentheses as bubbles, and there's 2 of them. So that's why we refer to it as the double bubble method for factoring. Now, to find this, what you do, there's a certain number of steps you want to follow. Basically, you're going to start with the x squared, and as we have our bubbles here at the bottom, the x squared you're simply going to split up and put 1 in each parenthesis. From here, you're going to move to the last term, or 6. And you want to write down or think of the different factors of 6, or different combinations of numbers that when multiplied equal 6. We have 1 times 6 and 2 times 3. Now you want to choose the 2 factors that actually have a sum of the middle term. So we have 1 plus 6 and 2 plus 3. If you look at our middle term, it's 5. So notice if you look down here, 2 times 3 is 6. That gave us our last term. And 2 plus 3 is 5, which gave us our middle term. Therefore, it's the 2 and the 3 that we want to put in the parentheses. And because they're both positive, we're going to give them both plus signs. And if you look back up to the middle box, notice it was x plus 3, x plus 2. The order does not matter. It does not matter if the x plus 2 comes first or the x plus 3. So once again, we take our x squared and split it up into the parentheses. From there, we move directly to the last term, and we find the factors of 6, which were 1 and 6, or 2 and 3. We choose the pair that have a sum of the middle number, 5. And that was our 2 and our 3. Therefore, those are the numbers we drop down into our binomials. So again, our factors of x squared plus 5x plus 6 are x plus 2 and x plus 3. Let's take a look at an additional problem. Going back to the FOIL method, which again you should be familiar with, x minus 5 times x plus 1. If we FOIL that, we should get x squared minus 4x minus 5. So let's just double check. X times x is x squared. X times 1 is 1x, or we could just put x. Then we distribute the negative 5. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. and negative 5 times 1 is negative 5. From here, we have like terms in the middle, so we will drop down the x squared, combine our like terms to get negative 4x, and then drop down the constant. And notice it matches our trinomial that was typed in red. So once again, the factors of x squared minus 4x minus 5 are x minus 5 and x plus 1. Now let's work backwards and make sure you understand if you started with the trinomial, how could we end up with x minus 5 and x plus 1 as our two factors? So let's go through the steps. Again, the first thing we want to do is take the x squared and split them up into parentheses, which we've already done. We then immediately move to the end term. In this case, it's a negative 5. So please remember to put that negative sign with the 5. Now you want to write all possible factors of negative 5, or numbers that multiply to negative 5. Now we've got a couple of options. We have negative 1 times 5, or we have 1 times negative 5. And only one of those is correct. The one that's correct will be the one that has a sum of the middle number, which would be negative 4. The first option has a sum of positive 4, so that should not be our choice. The second option, 1 plus negative 5, has a sum of negative 4, which means positive 1 and negative 5 should be our choices. So notice we have positive 1 in the second parenthesis. Again, it doesn't matter where you put the positive 1. And the negative 5 is in the first parenthesis. Let's take a look at some more examples. Okay, so in this one, we have x minus 8 times x minus 2. And if we FOIL it, we would get x squared minus 2x minus 8x plus 16. And then we combine our like terms to get x squared minus 10x plus 16. Now let's work backwards starting from our trinomial and prove using factoring that the factors of x squared minus 10x plus 16 are in fact x minus 8 and x minus 2. So we begin by splitting the x squared up into each parenthesis. Remember, we move then to the end number and find all of the factors. Now this one you're going to have to be careful of, because if you look ahead, you know that eventually the two numbers you choose have to have a sum of negative 10. In order for two numbers to have a sum of negative 10, at least one of those numbers must be negative. So as you're thinking of the different options for numbers that have a product of 16, you must look at the negative numbers as well. In fact, once you get used to this, you'll see the positive options won't even work for this problem. But for this first time, I'm going to go ahead and write it down all options. So we have 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. But if you notice, if you were to find the sum of those three options, none of those would add up to negative 10. 2 and 8 have a positive 10 for its sum, but we need a negative 10. So our other options to get a positive 16 would be negative 1 and negative 16, negative 2 and negative 8, and negative 4 and negative 4. Those products are all positive 16. If you then find the sum of those numbers, which one has a sum of negative 10, our middle number? This one here, negative 2 and negative 8. And you notice in the answer, those are the two numbers we have in our binomials. Let's look at an additional problem. Okay, this one's a little bit different. Notice that instead of having a trinomial down here, we have a binomial for the answer. The question is why? So if we do the FOIL method, we would get x squared, then x times positive 3 is positive 3x, then negative 3 times x is negative 3x, and negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. Now, notice that if we combine like terms in the middle, 3x minus 3x is actually 0x, which means we don't have to write it. So if we took that out completely, we would simply have x squared minus 9. So sometimes that will happen, and you'll be able to see that in advance if these two numbers are opposites of each other. Same number, just different signs. So let's work backwards and see, well, how would we factor it if we didn't know the factors of x squared minus 9, since it's a binomial and not a trinomial? Well, what you would want to do is you'd actually want to write it as a trinomial. So go ahead and write it with the 0x in the middle, and then factor it the same way you would in the previous problems. So let me pull down our binomials, or our factors of x squared minus 9, and we'll see how we get that. So first we split up the x's as usual, and then we move to the n number, the negative 9, and we want to write all of its factors. So its factors are negative 1 and 9, 1 and negative 9, and negative 3 and 3. And we want to choose the two that have a sum of 0, and that would be the negative 3 and 3. And notice those are the two numbers we have in our final answer. Match the trinomial with its factors. In this particular activity, you just want to be able to learn to look at these binomials and match them to their binomial, so the factors to their binomial. And again, notice in all of these, they have opposites. So you know the middle term will cancel because they add up to 0. So which one would the first one match up to? Hopefully you said x squared minus 9, because 3 times negative 3 is 9. Which one would the second one add up to? X squared minus 36, because 6 times negative 6 is negative 36. Number 3, the 16. And then the last one, 8 times negative 8, would be negative 64. So again, none of these have middle terms because the last term in each binomial are opposites, which add up to 0, which eliminates the middle term in your trinomial. Okay, there's some additional problems we need to take a look at, like x minus 4 quantity squared, because we want to know what that means. How can we get from x minus 4 quantity squared to x squared minus 8x plus 16, and then vice versa? Well, you need to recall that x minus 4 quantity squared means, remember, squared means that the base is being multiplied by itself. This entire binomial is the base, which means that has to be multiplied by itself. So you cannot just simply distribute the exponent of 2 to each term. You must write the binomial twice and then FOIL it. So from here, x times x is x squared. X times negative 4 is negative 4x. Negative 4 times x is negative 4x. And then negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. Now do the terms in the middle, when you combine them, add up to 0? They do not, because they are not opposites. One is not positive. It's simply negative 4 plus negative 4, which would give us negative 8x in the middle. And then our last term, or our constant, remains 16. Now, working backwards, the same way we did in the previous problems. How do we get to x minus 4 quantity squared? Well, again, we begin by separating the x squared and putting 1x in each binomial. From there, we move to the last term, and we write all of its factors. So we have 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4, but none of those have a sum of negative 8. So now we've got to move to the negatives. What would give us a what would give us a product of positive 16 but has negatives in it? Negative 1 and negative 16, negative 2 and negative 8, and negative 4 times negative 4. All of those have a product of positive 16. Now, if you look at the three options, the one that has a sum of negative 8 is negative 4 and negative 4. Now, because the binomial is the same, you can write it as x minus 4 quantity squared, because squared simply means that the base is being multiplied by itself. Okay, in this next problem, we're going to want to utilize something that you've learned in previous lessons, and that is you always want to, before you factor, look to see, especially if there's a number in front of x squared, if you can factor out a greatest common factor first. So let's look at the numbers. Is there a greatest common factor of 2, 22, and 20? In other words, is there a number that divides into all three of those numbers? It's 2. So what we want to do is pull the 2 out of the trinomial, and then whatever we have left will be our remaining trinomial, and we will then factor that. So right now we will divide the 2's and drop down our x squared. Then we will divide 22 and 2, and we get 11x. We will then divide 20 and 2 and get 10. So you can see that we have 2 on the outside, which is our greatest common factor, and then we have our trinomial on the inside. Now the trinomial we want to actually factor using the double bubble method that we've just learned. The 2 will remain on the outside, so our final answer will look like this, with the 2 just dropping down. So let's go ahead over on the side here and factor x squared plus 11x plus 10. So again, we will split up the x squared, then we will find the factors of 10 that have a sum of 11. So we have 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. And right away, you probably saw that 1 plus 10 gives us a sum of 11. So we're going to use a positive 1 and a positive 10. So let's bring that information back over here because we want to make sure that we don't forget about the 2. The reason is because if we were actually to multiply this back out, we want to get back to the original trinomial in red. However, if you multiplied this out, x plus 1 times x plus 10, you would get to this trinomial, but not to this one, because you would have forgotten the 2 on the outside. So make sure you include the 2 when you're factoring. So this is a similar problem. Again, if there's a number in front of x squared, always begin by looking to see if you can factor out the greatest common factor, if there is one. In this case, 3 is the greatest common factor. So bring that down, and then go ahead and divide to pull it out of the trinomial. So we'll have x squared minus, and then 15 divided by 3 would be 5x minus 6. Drop down your 3 and have your answer set up. That way you remember the 3. Don't wait until the end, because then you tend to forget that 3. Okay, so we're working with this trinomial x squared minus 5x minus 6. Let's find its factors. So we'll split up the x, and then we need to find all of the factors of negative 6. So we have negative 1 and 6, 1 and negative 6, 2 and negative 3, and negative 2 and 3. So again, you've got to make sure and find every option. Now you're going to choose the one that has a sum of negative 5. And if you look and add them together, only one of them has a sum of negative 5. And that is positive 1 and negative 6. And again, it does not matter where the positive 1 goes or the negative 6. So our factors, we will then bring back down here. So we will have 3 on the outside and then times x plus 1 times x minus 6 as our final answer. In this problem, we will again, because we have a 2 in front of x squared, factor out the greatest common factor. So 2 would be our greatest common factor. So we would be left with x squared minus 8x plus 12. And we'll set up our answer with our 2 bubbles, or our 2 parentheses. Then bring our x squared up to the right, and then we will find the factors of x squared minus 8x plus 12. So beginning with positive 12, we have 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 times 4. That equals 12. However, none of those three options has a sum of negative 8. So now, because the 12 is positive, we need to make both numbers negative so that we still have a product that's positive 12. Then we will look and see which one of these options has a sum of negative 8. And that would be the negative 2 and the negative 6. So let's bring that back down, and our final answer would be 2 times x minus 2 times x minus 6. In this problem here, although it's a binomial, because there's a number in front of x squared, we still want to start by factoring out the greatest common factor. So we would be left with x squared minus 25. Now, although this is not a trinomial, because it starts with x squared, you need to see if you can factor it. So remember, you want to make it a trinomial by putting a 0x in the middle. So let me go ahead and set up the answer. Then over to the right, the x squared minus 25, we're going to make a trinomial by adding the 0x in the middle. So we will then factor this by splitting up the x squared, and then finding the factors of the last term. And this would be negative 1 times 25, 1 times negative 25, or 5 times negative 5. And we want to choose the option that has a sum of 0. In this case, 5 plus negative 5 equals 0, so we should put 1 positive 5 and 1 negative 5 in our answer. So our final answer would be 5 outside the parentheses, which is our greatest common factor, times x plus 5 times x minus 5. Let's try another one of these. So factoring out our greatest common factor would be 3. So we would have 3 times x squared minus 1. So we know our answer should probably look like this if x squared minus 1 is factorable. So to see if it is, we have x squared plus 0x minus 1. We're going to write it as a trinomial. Split up our x squareds. And then we need to find the factors of negative 1. So negative 1 times 1 is our only option. So as long as its sum is 0, then we can put in our parentheses a negative 1 and a positive 1. So we will bring that down into our final answer. So it'd be 3 times x minus 1 times x plus 1 as our factors. And that completes the lesson on factoring trinomials using the double bubble method.